Hello, friends. During the long centuries of slavery in America, the abuse of enslaved black men is often told in terms of brutal labor, whippings, and violent punishment by white male slaveholders. Yet another dark and less discussed reality existed. In the shadows, sexual exploitation by white women. In the secrecy of night, when plantation houses and slave quarters fell quiet, many black male slaves became the silent victims of coercion and abuse by their female owners. This hidden chapter of slavery is what some call the story of the night slaves. White women in slave-holding households were not powerless figures, though often portrayed as such in history. They too wielded authority over enslaved men, particularly those who served as personal attendants, houseworkers, or stable hands. Some used this power to force black men into sexual encounters against their will, knowing the enslaved had no means of refusal. For an enslaved man, saying no to a white woman could lead to whipping, mutilation, or even death if the accusation of defiance reached her husband or overseer. The abuse was cloaked in silence. Unlike the more widely documented rape of enslaved black women by white men, which produced generations of mixed-race children, the sexual violation of enslaved men was buried beneath layers of shame, secrecy, and fear. If discovered, these men could be accused of assaulting a white woman, a charge that almost always meant lynching or execution. White women's abuse of enslaved men thus remained hidden, denied, and erased from many official records. Yet whispers of it appear in narratives of formerly enslaved people, court records, and slave testimonies collected after emancipation. Some men described being summoned late at night to the quarters of the mistress, threatened with punishment if they refused her demands. Others told of being groomed for the role, chosen for their youth, strength, or physical appearance. These men carried not only the physical danger of exposure, but also the crushing psychological trauma of being stripped of agency, trapped in a cycle of forced intimacy that could never be spoken of. For the white women involved, these relationships often served as outlets for loneliness, revenge against unfaithful husbands, or the exertion of unchecked power. In a society where white womanhood was portrayed as pure and virtuous, this hidden abuse was protected by silence. The enslaved men, stripped of all protection under the law, had no recourse. Their bodies were commodities, their resistance erased, and their suffering silenced. The legacy of the night slaves is one of both trauma and erasure. Generations of black men carried the unspoken scars of this abuse, passed down through stories told in hushed tones within families or buried in silence altogether. Modern historians and scholars of slavery are beginning to uncover and confront this silenced truth, acknowledging that sexual violence during slavery was not limited to white men against black women. It also included white women against black men. This history reveals the full depth of slavery's violence, showing how power corrupts and how oppression manifests in every possible form. It also challenges the myth of white women as passive bystanders in slavery, reminding us that they too could be enforcers of brutality in the dark of night. Some of the most telling evidence about the hidden abuse of enslaved black men by white women comes from slave narratives recorded in the 19th century and the WPA, Works Progress Administration, interviews of the 1930s, where formerly enslaved people recalled the lives they endured. Although the accounts are often veiled in vague language due to the taboo nature of the subject, they reveal glimpses of a reality that was dangerous even to speak of. Several narratives describe enslaved men who were ordered into the bedrooms of their mistresses. These orders carried the force of life and death. Refusal could mean severe whipping or being sold off. Some testimonies recount how young boys, often in their early teens, were targeted because of their youth and physical strength. They were kept close in the house, performing domestic duties during the day and forced into silence at night. Historians note that court records from the antebellum South occasionally hint at these dynamics. While rare, some cases of white women accused of impropriety with enslaved men surfaced. However, the charges were not about protecting the enslaved. They were about protecting white honor. Enslaved men, if discovered, were never treated as victims. Instead, they risked being tortured, castrated, or lynched on the mere suspicion of relations with a white woman, even if they had been forced into it. The law worked to protect white women's reputations, not enslaved men's lives. The silence was further reinforced by the myth of white womanhood during slavery. White women were portrayed as virtuous, chaste, and morally superior. To acknowledge that they too were capable of sexual violence against enslaved men would undermine the racial and gender hierarchy of the South. Therefore, historians suggest that plantation society actively erased or ignored these realities, making them nearly invisible in official documents. Yet within the black community, the memory of this abuse lingered. Folklore, family stories, and generational whispers carried traces of what was too dangerous to say openly. Some accounts tell of enslaved men who fathered children by their white mistresses, though the paternity was often hidden or denied. These children, if they survived, lived complicated lives, sometimes raised in secrecy, sometimes abandoned to the slave quarters, but almost always reminders of a forbidden truth. Modern scholarship has begun to shed more light on this silenced history. Researchers like historians Dana Ramey Berry and Thomas Foster have argued that enslaved men's sexual vulnerability has been overlooked in favor of focusing solely on the abuse of women. They emphasize that slavery was not only about forced labor but also about sexual domination of all genders. The psychological impact on the men who endured this abuse was immense. For them, sex was not intimacy, but a weapon used against their dignity. They lived under the crushing knowledge that they could never resist, never speak out, and never be believed. Their silence was survival. This night history reveals slavery in its most complete form. Not just chains and whips, but also the hidden violations that corrupted even the most private aspects of enslaved people's lives. It shows that power, when absolute, knows no boundaries, and that the abuse of enslaved men by white women was a reality deliberately buried beneath the myths of the Old South.